They're delivering tremendous amounts of value to educate and build trust with these leads that you want to have in and around the data center ecosystem. They totally understand the customer insight on each of your most important stakeholders on that decision committee, each of their most important goals and challenges, and they're showing up becoming a tremendous resource to help that particular person understand not only the answers to the questions that they currently have, but helping to proactively guide them to the typical milestones and roadmap that a person like that in that particular job function, in that particular geographic region, at a company at roughly that size in a specific kind of industry or business model. Because your specialization, your knowledge internally that you have among your client-facing team members is that hyper-specific and is that uniquely valuable. So it feels a lot less like selling, and it feels a lot more like your prospects and clients are spending their time with a big four consultant, like they went out and hired KPMG or Deloitte or EY or PwC or something like that. It's that next level. Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Sales and Marketing live Q&A show, the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing live Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest questions that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, from data center operators like hyperscalers, colocation companies, wholesale data centers, edge and modular data center providers, as well as data center technology and facilities companies that sell to and partner with data center related companies. Plus there's construction and real estate companies and investors in and around the data center, digital infrastructure and critical facilities, as well as outsourced sales and marketing companies that work with data centers, digital infrastructure and critical facilities. And regardless of what role that you would, regardless of what your function is on the go-to-market team, maybe you're in sales, marketing, account management, product, channel partnerships, or perhaps you're the maestro, the orchestra conductor, the executor in chief, collaborator, aligner in chief, getting everyone in the right seats on the bus, rowing the boat at the right speed, playing at the right tempo, and making sure that everything all comes together to help each individual and team member and groups of teams across your company achieve their ambitious growth goals in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical infrastructure. If this is your first time joining us for the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A, our weekly live show, welcome. I'm Joshua Feinberg from the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We're all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market professionals in the growth of the data center industry. If you have any kind of input, any kind of role, any kind of stake in growing your career, growing your team's impact, growing your company's impact in and around the ecosystem, you are for sure in the right place. So what is on the agenda? What are the biggest challenges that we'll be looking at this week? First up, how to generate quality data center leads. Next, we'll get into how to generate leads for data center power technology. After that, we'll turn our attention to how to hire good salespeople for Tier 4 data center colocation services. Then we'll take a quick break for a message from our sponsor. After that, we'll look at how to increase lead generation for power-saving technologies in and around data centers. After that, we'll look at how to grow a data center decarbonization and heat reuse consultancy. And as we head down the home stretch on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll wrap up today with a look at how to generate data center storage leads. If you have an idea for a topic or a big sales and marketing challenge that we should address in an upcoming episode in one of our upcoming Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A shows, please be sure to leave that as a comment on whatever platform you're watching on, and we'll do our best to get that in the queue for an upcoming weekly show. So first up, What should we look at this week? Oh, one more quick thing. If you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming resources and educational events like this, make sure that you subscribe to our data center sales and marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox on Sundays. You can subscribe on our website at www.dcsmi.com. So, first question up is, how do we generate quality data center leads? How do we generate quality data center leads? So, my first advice is, when it comes to generating leads, the word quality can mean different things for different companies and even different teams within different companies. And it actually introduces a bit of subjectivity if you're not really careful with that. And that subjectivity is a lot of times what gets marketing and sales teams into some pretty heated arguments. So let's head that off by proactively defining what quality actually means. So the first thing we need to figure out is, from what companies do you want these leads to be coming from? At the account level, at the company level, how do we dial that in? And usually for most companies in and around the data center ecosystem that are established, they're going to look at where they've been most successful. They'll look at their logos, they'll look at case studies, testimonials, reviews, they'll look in their CRM for their closed won deals, their happy customers, and they'll try to figure out the pattern recognition. They'll try to get to the heart of like the basic 3 or 4 areas that define an ideal client profile. Like, where are these companies located? And what location do these leads need to be coming from? Can the leads be anywhere on the planet? Can you literally do business in dozens of different countries and dozens of different languages? Or do you need to dial in and be way more specific and say, like, nope, they need to be in this country or that country or this region within this country or this group of states or this group of provinces? Get really, really specific on the geographies where you can successfully market, sell, and service your data center clients. Next, let's get self-aware about the size of clients that make sense to be doing business with your company today. Not necessarily where you want to be 12, 18, 24, 36 months down the road, but given where you can win deals today, where you can adequately retain and get good onboarding and the clients easily get to initial value, intended value, and extended value. Where can those things happen today in terms of their company size? And I recognize that for a big part of the data center operator ecosystem and other parts of the data center ecosystem, when I say size, your first reaction is kilowatts or megawatts or square feet or square meters. The reality, though, is when it comes to lead generation, at some point you want to normalize that, standardize that into like employee headcount or number of employees, or even revenue, annual turnover. But let's say for number of employees, what's the minimum size company that's likely going to have the resources to afford your minimum level of engagement? And along the same lines, are there certain companies that are so massively large with tens of thousands of employees that your company just may not have the resources to properly market, sell, and service them today? So with that in mind, for most companies, you're going to typically end up with a range where they need to be a certain amount, have a certain amount of employees, but not over a certain level to be in your sweet spot for what a quality lead, for what a qualified lead would look like. For your company, maybe it's a minimum of 50 employees and a maximum of 5,000 employees. It really, again, it depends quite dramatically based on your company's size, your resources, your addressable market, where you have coverage for sales and marketing and being able to install and configure and service various clients. So we talked about the geography part of it, of what determines a qualified lead. We talked about company size. Another thing that's for sure a big issue in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities has to do with industry or business model or vertical markets, as they're sometimes called. And why is that a big deal? Because when you think about like a Venn diagram, at the intersection of your client's location, the geography part that we were just talking about a few moments ago, and a particular industry, certain kinds of compliance requirements or certifications or accreditations tend to pop up for certain kinds of regulated industries. In certain locations, it doesn't matter the industry, everything is regulated. big parts of the European Union would be a perfect example of that. There are certain states with the United States where it's an across the board, where there's certain things that you either have or don't have to be qualified to do business in that particular region for most parts of the data center ecosystem among the 52 or 57 different business models in and around data centers. But when you add in certain kinds of industry targeting, like healthcare, education, government, financial services, there's for sure in many different regions around the world additional compliance requirements, additional certification requirements that pop up. So if you have those, great. That industry should be explicitly included of what a qualified lead looks like. If you don't have that, that industry should be explicitly excluded from being qualified in your range of what's a ideal client profile or what a qualified lead particularly looks like. So when it comes to generating qualified leads, quality data center leads, to avoid any misunderstandings between the executive team and the sales team and the marketing team and the rest of the company as a whole. And when you look at your entire company, it's super important to document these 3 or 4 parts of what makes a company a great fit for working with your company, sometimes called an account. And that gets baked into a simple 1-page document, ideal client profile, ICP. Then within those companies, who are the ideal people that you need to be building relationships with, where these leads should be coming from the ideal people that you want to be educating and building trust with throughout their full buyer's journey, from the earliest signs of having a problem or a goal they're trying to figure out to the middle of the buyer's journey, where they're starting to compare the different kinds of solution options that you could put in front of them. And then it's the decision stage when they're usually finally ready for a sales conversation. And to put this in context, it's critical, mission critical, that you're aware that many of your buyers now, most of your buyers now prefer a self-guided buyer's journey, a self-service buyer's journey, where most of their researching and comparing options and decision making is happening without you in the room. And it wasn't always this way. If we were talking about this like back in the 2010s, at that time, CEB, the Corporate Executive Board, that's now part of Gartner, found that 56% of a typical buyer's journey was over before sales contact. And it was that way for quite some time, from the relatively early days of digital and search engines and mobile and social media. So that was the state of how your buyers were reacting, behaving in the mid 2010s. 56%, typically about half of the sales cycle, happened without you in the room. But that wasn't too bad, right? You still were in there for the final 44% of the buyer's journey. Add a decade of digital transformation, add a lot of baby boomers retiring and a lot more millennials and Gen Z being in decision-making roles, add millions, at some point, tens of millions of people working from home. And that 56% number has jumped all the way to 83%. Like the latest research out of Gartner found that 83% of a typical buyer's journey is over before sales contact, before vendor contact. That means that you're only in there, best case scenario, for the last 17% of the journey. And where it's super challenging is in that first 83%, your prospects and clients are learning from someone. Are they learning from your direct competitors, your indirect competitors? Are they learning from non-business model competitors like associations, events and media companies, channel partner programs that you're competing with or adjacent to you? But make no mistake, your most important buyer personas are learning from someone. The question is, do you want them to be learning from someone who is working against you? Or do you want them to be learning from the brilliant people on your own team? And this causes the entire go-to-market sales and marketing playbook to need to be rethought going forward. And it's not like this is a future prediction. This is already here, and it's been here for 3, 4, 5 years at this point. What this means is the members of your client-facing team that are still showing up with conventional job titles saying, "Hi, I'm an account executive. Hi, I'm a sales development rep. Nice to meet you." The reality is, when your business card, when your LinkedIn profile, when your email signature shows up like that, fully expect that most prospects are not going to be willing to talk with that person until they're almost ready to buy. If that same person who knows quite a bit about your business, who knows quite a bit about data centers, critical facilities, and digital infrastructure, and most importantly, knows about this particular buyer persona that they're talking with, whether it's finance professionals, IT professionals, infrastructure engineers, facilities managers, whatever it is, they understand this kind of stakeholder and their kind of business pretty well. The repositioning, the makeover that needs to happen is for that individual to now show up and act and deliver on the idea of being more like a consultant, a trusted advisor, a subject matter expert, a teacher. And in some cases, some of the more advanced members on your client facing teams may even be able to be seen as thought leaders. This is incredibly important because this is the way that you earn your way back in to have a significant role in that first 83% of the buyer's journey, where you still have an opportunity to significantly impact how your prospects and clients navigate all of the different options in front of them. In a typical buyer's journey for something like data centers, digital infrastructure, critical facilities, there may be roughly 28 touch points, 28 interactions that happen between complete stranger and purchase decision. For a lot of companies in and around data centers that are completely asleep at the wheel, they're investing a ton in one or two or three touch points, and they're really, really, really leaving to chance, betting their company's future on hoping that those two or three touch points were enough. And unfortunately, in most cases, it's not. And it leaves your sales team, it leaves your revenue organization, it leaves your company in a really vulnerable position to be disrupted by someone that comes in and has an active role in a lot of those and many of those 28 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision. They're showing up and they're over indexing. They're delivering tremendous amounts of value to educate and build trust with these leads that you want to have in and around the data center ecosystem. They totally understand the customer insight on each of your most important stakeholders on that decision committee, each of their most important goals and challenges. And they're showing up, becoming a tremendous resource to help that particular person understand not only the answers to the questions that they currently have, but helping to proactively guide them to the typical milestones and roadmap that a person like that in that particular job function, in that particular geographic region, at a company at roughly that size in a specific kind of industry or business model, because your specialization, your knowledge internally that you have among your client facing team members is that hyper specific and is that uniquely valuable. So it feels a lot less like selling, and it feels a lot more like your prospects and clients are spending their time with a big four consultant, like they went out and hired KPMG or Deloitte or EY or PwC or something like that. It's that next level. This changes the nature of who you hire going forward. This changes the nature of how aggressive you need to be in investing in professional development and upskilling and cross training and retraining and keeping everyone on the bleeding edge of what they need to have to add a lot of value to their clients. This changes the nature in many cases of how you specialize your sales and marketing teams to have extreme expertise in certain kind of niches. But this isn't going to happen overnight. This is a big culture change for a lot of companies. And depending on your company's size, your internal champion may need to be all the way up at the CEO level. If you work at a Fortune 1000, a Fortune 500 company with tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of employees, no, it's very unlikely that your CEO is going to be the internal champion of this kind of initiative, of saying, hey, we're tired of getting pushed around in the sales process. We're tired of our prospects and clients treating our team members like crap. We're better than that. We're smarter than that. And gosh darn it, we got to let the world know about it. That kind of initiative, that kind of internal champion, that is totally necessary if your company has a few dozen or a few hundred employees. If you're significantly larger, that kind of C-level internal champion, C-level executive sponsor is typically like a chief commercial officer, or chief revenue officer, or chief marketing officer, or something like that. But make no mistake, if you're still leading with a pitch, if you're still leading with a product spec sheet, if you're still leading with collateral that was provided to you by companies that you represent, this isn't something that's going to happen in a couple of years. This is something that has already happened. The only question is how far along you're going to let this get out of hand. And if you're looking to understand, like, well, how did we miss this? What were the early signs of this? Well, most SaaS companies, software as a service companies, and hyperscalers and public cloud companies have been using this exact playbook for the better part of a decade now. For some crazy reason, leaders in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities thought that what they had was so incredibly special that the exact same CTO or director of infrastructure or director of IT operations or whatever would prefer the self-driven journey and all that convenience and being in the driver's seat with SaaS companies, and like, oh, no, you're from a data center operator. We'll go back to buying the way we did 20 years ago when MySpace was a thing and you still had a BlackBerry. Seems a little far-fetched, right? So, the interesting part is when people push back and they say, we know our buyers. I'm like, how well do you know your buyers, and how recent have you done thorough buyer persona research, customer insight research? Because I'm on the younger side of Gen X. All of the baby boomers that I know that still work full-time, or most of them are in more part-time roles at this point in time. Everyone that's still going to conferences, that's still actively involved in the data center industry that I'm aware of, totally is on LinkedIn several times a day. They attend webinars, they speak at webinars, they watch YouTube videos, they're on podcasts. Some of them have their own podcasts. You want to test this out? Try commenting on one of the posts that they've shared on LinkedIn and watch within a matter of minutes, they're interacting back and liking your post. This is not a digitally resistant baby boomer. So we have now reached the tipping point where nearly everyone in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities prefers this digital-driven buyer's journey and only wants to spend time with a company in the context of traditional sales when they are almost ready to buy. So this is extremely important to your overall approach to generating quality data center leads. Is the purpose of this lead generation is to understand who they are and where they are in the journey. By who they are, what do you know about this particular buyer persona? What are their biggest goals? What are their biggest challenges? What if they get right? We'll get them a big bonus and a promotion. What if they screw up? Could potentially derail their career. What's messing up their work-life balance? What's causing them and their team members incredible amounts of stress? What's threatening their company's survival, their career track? Once you have the consensus on that in their own words, and this is why we need to do the research. We can't just talk to a couple of internal team members. We need to have either face-to-face or video conversations or surveys or studying their search and social footprint. But we need to get the consensus on these issues in their own words, because that is the path forward to putting out incredibly helpful, relevant educational content and planning, promoting, and hosting incredibly impactful educational events. And we need to be self-aware enough to recognize that different kinds of stakeholders care about different kinds of issues. The one that's most important to your company's economic impact, your financial goals, you'll almost certainly designate as your primary buyer persona. The second most important kind of stakeholder that shows up on these decision committees will be your secondary buyer persona. The third most important kind of stakeholder that may show up on larger decision committees, you'd call that a tertiary buyer persona. And the person that shows up that knocks the whole thing off track for their own self-serving interest, like a detractor, that's a negative buyer persona. So once we understand that, we can get our segmentation right, we can get our targeting right, we can document this, and we can make sure that our lead generation is focusing on the right people. then we also need to be aware that in a self-driven buyer's journey, the self-service buyer's journey, we got to have a significant presence in the awareness stage and in the consideration stage. We can't just phone it in and keep our fingers crossed and wait all the way to the decision stage to start generating leads. So how do we know what these topics are? Well, once you've done your homework, it becomes a lot more straightforward to figure out what their goals and challenges are and how we're going to create these great educational resources and great educational events that allows us to dramatically build up the know, like, and trust. And when these qualified leads are spending significant amounts of those 28 touch points with members of your client-facing team, beautiful things start to happen. For example, your company is nearly guaranteed to stay on the shortlist. When you do this exceptionally well, you'll also find that the people that are consuming these kind of educational resources and attending these kinds of events start to become really receptive when you send them an email that says, hey, I see you're registered for our lunch and learn next week, typically for cybersecurity or facilities, energy management, or whatever. It takes a village. There's usually stakeholders involved from these 3 or 4 different teams. With that in mind, is there anyone else from your team that should also attend? If so, hit the forward button on your email, write a sentence or 2, and feel free to invite your colleagues. We'd love to host them as well. And this is starting to work because you look down at your registration rosters and you look down at your attendance rosters. You're like, wow, that's pretty interesting. There's 35 people registered for this. There's 340 people registered for this. And there's a cluster of like 5, 6, 7 people from the exact same company that registered within a half hour, 45 minutes of each other. That's amazing. They're talking about us. So when you do this right, this is how you start to meet the decision committee while there is still a significant chance to impact how they navigate this whole research and decision-making process. If you're not found, you're leaving it to chance that they find you at all, and you may be immediately treading water because one of your more proactive, forward-thinking competitors got in there early and often and is educating and building trust with the leads that you want to be having. So when it comes to generating qualified data center leads, make sure that you're on the same page internally about who these leads are, what company they come from, who they are individually, what they care about, and then build your whole lead generation program, lead nurturing and sales cycle acceleration program around having a very, very valuable presence, educational presence, consultative kind of presence in as many of those 28 touch points as possible between complete stranger and purchase decisions. So that's how to generate more quality data center leads. Next question up is, by the way, if you're getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button to let your friends, family, coworkers, colleagues know about this resource. And if you have an idea for an upcoming topic that you'd like to see us address in an upcoming show, in an upcoming episode, feel free to drop that into the comments. And as long as it adds value to a significant part of the ecosystem, we'll get it in the queue to address in an upcoming show. Next question up is, how do we generate leads for data center power technology? So your company provides power technology solutions for data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. A lot more dealing with facility-related professionals as opposed to IT professionals, but in a small enough data center operator facility or end user facility, a lot of times there's blurring of the lines between those two roles. So to generate leads for data center power technology, the first thing that we need to do is dial in what companies are the best fit for you, where they're located, how big or small they are, what industries, what business models they tend to be. And then based on their size and your size, we need to get a handle on who are the people that typically influence whether a company buys your power technology or not, or whether they buy from another company or not. And the way you generally figure that out is you look at where you've been most successful, what accounts you've won, what accounts you've retained, what accounts you've expanded over time. And you look in your CRM, your customer relationship management system, and you start to sleuth out who are the people that were involved pre-sales, who were involved in the decision-making process, who are the people that were involved post-sales. And we're looking for patterns. We're looking for across 5, 10, 20 different companies. Who do we consistently see showing up? Because what we're looking to essentially do is figure out who is the most important economic stakeholder that plays a role in deciding whether or not a company moves forward with your data center power technology. That we'd call a primary buyer persona. And we need to know that primary buyer persona's biggest goals and challenges. Because once we know in their own words what they need to figure out individually, what they need to achieve as a team, what they need to achieve as a company, a lot of times these things show up in job descriptions, we can dramatically improve our educational lead generation resources, our educational events that also become lead generation opportunities. Getting that figured out in their own words is incredibly impactful. And doing the opposite, guessing about what those words are, is the opposite of impactful. So that's on the goals side. These also sometimes show up in their OKRs, or objectives and key results. If you have a good enough relationship with your prospects and clients, they're willing to share those with you. On the flip side of it, we also know that people will be motivated to take action around data center power technology because they're facing a lot of frustration in certain kinds of areas. They're facing a lot of struggles. They're facing a lot of stress. There's certain things having to do with power technology that are causing them to have a crappy work-life balance, that are forcing them to get called while they're out on vacation. So it's really annoying their family and their loved ones, their significant other and their kids or whoever else they're supposed to be enjoying this downtime with. And this is really, really a big problem. So to the extent that you're able to introduce them to best practices and methodologies and playbooks for how others like them have navigated these data center power technology challenges, you can be a superhero. You can really, really be someone that has some extremely welcome advice that can help them individually, help their team, help their company navigate these power challenges in and around data centers. So figuring out like what kinds of companies and what kinds of stakeholders care most about your data center power technology is incredibly important for lead generation. Because once we have that and we know the highest frequency areas, we can set about building a content calendar. We can build an event calendar. We can say, gee, we're going to have a webinar series on the third Wednesday of every month. And this is the topic that the next 12 topics that we're going to cover. Or if we're fortunate enough that our prospects and clients are in close proximity to our office, to our facility, wherever, where they can drive there within a half hour to an hour, well, we're going to have a breakfast seminar series or a lunch and learn series, as long as you have a classroom or conference room or some foyer area that can be repurposed or whatever for that kind of event. Incredibly impactful to get your prospects and clients to spend time with members of your client-facing team in an educational context, not in an infomercial context, not in a, hey, come on over and let us pitch you kind of context, but in a way that they see your client-facing team members more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, and likely the most senior members on your team who are like walking Wikipedias of data center power technology. Those folks they should see as thought leaders. So when we get all of that together, the lead generation becomes more about a value exchange. You have a piece of information, a resource, a piece of content, or an events experience that's so insanely valuable that they're essentially willing to trade their business card information for what's on the other side of the landing page, for what's on the other side of the registration. And when you do this well, you'll see these folks keep coming back to you over and over and over again to keep learning from you. When you do this really well, they also start to become very receptive to your suggestions like, hey, who else at your company, who else on your team needs to know about this or attend this or watch this? And you'll know it's working because you see clusters of people from the same company registering for, attending, all that great stuff. And amazingly impactful things happen to your sales process when there's multiple stakeholders from the decision committee that are engaging with you early and often. Actually, a lot of what it means to be an account executive going forward comes down to coaching and project managing with your internal champion to help that internal person get resources and buy-in across their internal team members and other teams within their own organization. No one really needs you to get better at selling. They need you to get better at supporting their buying process, which by definition means a lot of your interactions going forward are going to feel a lot more like consulting for your prospects and clients and a lot less like the kind of selling that you may have done for the first 5, 10, 20 years of your career, or however established your career is. So we need to know, when it comes to power technology, what do they need to accomplish and what's driving them nuts? And we need to know the answers to those issues, those questions, for your first, at least your first and your second most important groups of stakeholders. And if there's a third most important group of stakeholders, for that segment as well. And when we can develop this incredibly personalized, incredibly relevant experience that's customized, that's personalized for each kind of stakeholder and for each stage, each part of the buyer's journey, what you'll likely, I always tell people, think about if you have 3 stages of the buyer's journey: awareness and consideration and decision. And if you have 3 different kinds of buyer personas, which for power technology, maybe it's a facilities director, maybe it's a infrastructure engineer, maybe it's a CFO, whatever. I mean, this is going to vary depending on your business model, your company size, and their company size. But let's imagine there's a facilities professional, there's a technology professional, there's a finance professional, or maybe a compliance professional or ESG officer or something like that in that third slot. When you can deliver amazingly helpful educational resources and educational experiences where that kind of person wants to spend time with you, as opposed to you having to chase and beg and nag to get time on their calendar, it is a game changer for generating leads and nurturing leads and accelerating those leads into great sales opportunities. So much so that it nearly guarantees that your company stays on the short list. If you do this exceptionally well, competitors that you thought were in the running with you will start to drop off the short list, because those stakeholders on the decision committee realize that no one's going to hold a candle to the amount of ridiculously smart people that you have on your team. And when they finally get to that last 17% of the buyer's journey where they're open to a sales kind of context, you'll discover their team members are quoting you. They literally used your educational resources, your educational events as the framework for how they navigated this entire initiative. And when that happens, that is a beautiful thing. The sales close easier. There's no haggling. There's no going back and forth on terms and price competition. And it's a beautiful thing as well post-purchase, because your account managers, your customer success managers have new clients that are incredibly bought into your way of approaching data center power technology. They're a lot more likely to have a very smooth, accelerated onboarding experience, to jump from initial value, intended value, extended value, to become great promoters, ambassadors of your brand that refer their colleagues, and all those great things that happen post-purchase in customer activation and customer marketing. And planting the seeds for that starts with getting in as early as possible, the right people in the right place at the right time, and most of all, in the right context. So it's not just about lead generation. It's about your prospects and clients seeing your company and your client-facing team members as the be-all, end-all experts when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center power technology. Next question up, what do we got? How do we hire good salespeople for tier 4 data center colocation services? So how do we hire the right kind of salespeople, good salespeople, effective salespeople for tier 4 data center colocation? Well, the answer today is actually quite different than it would have been 10, 15 years ago, back when colocation was really starting to just pick up traction in the marketplace. Today, we need to recognize that there's certain parts of colocation that have already become commoditized, especially if you have a legacy facility where you're struggling on rack density because there just isn't enough power to go around. But big picture, the nature of what it means to sell has changed quite a bit. And this definition, this framework for what it takes to be successful in data center sales, has to adapt to adjust to the self-driven buyer's journey. What does this mean? A decade ago, someone selling colocation was likely going to get to spend about half of their prospects, half of their clients' research and decision-making process with them. at the time, 10 years ago, it was widely believed that 56% of the buyer's journey was happening before you got to meet a prospecting client, which meant that in most situations, 44%, almost half of the research and decision making process happened with someone from your sales team in the room, either virtually or sitting on their side of the table, giving the tours, whatever else was impactful for the decision making process around colocation. Unfortunately, those days are long in the rearview mirror. Add 10 years of digital transformation, generational changes as baby boomers retire and more Gen Z, more millennials are in decision making roles, millions, tens of millions of people working from home. And then we've now arrived in this place where 83% of a typical buyer's journey is over before you get to meet a prospect in a sales context. In other words, they don't want to meet with you. Your prospects and clients don't want to meet with an account executive or sales development rep anymore until they're almost ready to buy. If you're lucky, you're in there for the last 17% of the buyer's journey. This is a huge challenge for companies with a traditional sales and marketing playbook that they haven't adjusted much in the last 5 or 10 years. But it's also an enormous opportunity, a big opening for companies that can get in front of this. What does it mean to get in front of this? What it means is dialing in how your account executives and sales development reps position themselves to the marketplace. So instead of being seen by their traditional job titles, their prospects and clients perceive them to be more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, and some in more senior levels on your team may even be seen as thought leaders. What does this mean in practice? Well, I host interviews every single week on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast with all different kinds of sales professionals, actually across the full go-to-market team, across the full data center ecosystem. And one thing that I've seen coming up quite a bit among data center operators, like companies that are heavily involved in selling colocation and hyperscale and other kinds of digital infrastructure, the sales professionals that have sustained their careers have a level of technical knowledge that, frankly, you might find quite surprising. When I hear these folks describe like what they do with their nights and weekends computer lab in their home office, in their basement, wherever it is, what they're doing in their downtime to keep their skills sharp and to stay relevant to the most important prospects and clients that they want to build their relationship with. It's not just that they're checking off the box on some entry-level IT or networking kind of certifications. No, their level of knowledge about anything and everything that you can see in a data center that a client would be curious about when you're giving a tour is so next level that these folks, if they wanted to, on a nights and weekends kind of side hustle project, could hang out a shingle and be a fractional CTO, an outsourced CTO for small and medium-sized businesses in their local area. Why did that jump off the page with me? Well, early on in my career, I actually had a business like that I ran for 3-4 years, working with small and medium-sized businesses as a fractional CTO. So the fact that it's gotten to the point where account executives and sales development reps, business development reps working for major data center operators, even relatively small operators, have gotten that level of knowledge. This is what allows them to have meaningful conversations with people across the decision-making committee when it comes to their clients that are interested in tier 4 data center colocation services. Without that, if you're just having these folks be able to read the information that's on your website or read the information on the slides, they're already treading water. And the reality is most highly technical, highly cynical IT professionals really are not going to want to spend much time with these folks anymore. So this changes the nature of who you hire. This changes how you and your sales professionals need to invest in professional development. This changes the nature of reskilling, upskilling, playing the long game, and almost certainly is also going to force some industry specializations because it's pretty crowded. If you have sales teams that are selling to a dozen or 2 dozen different industries, and they just know a teeny little bit about those dozen or 2 dozen industries, but If you have the focus, if you have the deep expertise where you have account executives who are exceptionally knowledgeable about how colocation is used in financial services or being used in healthcare or being used in manufacturing, all of a sudden the level of expertise that they bring to the table for their prospects and clients is not something where they're going to need to beg for meetings. Their prospects and clients are going to actually enjoy and get a lot of value from spending time, significant amounts of time with your client facing team members. So much so that when this is done well, members of your client facing team should be able to be actively involved in some of these educational resources that you're creating, and certainly in the educational events. If they're not the be all end all subject matter expert, they should for sure know enough of your successful clients and your channel partners that they can be the one moderating a webinar panel or moderating a breakfast seminar panel or lunch and learn panel or something like that, because they know for sure who to go to, who to invite, and what kinds of questions would provide a lot of value to the audience for this particular buyer persona. But yeah, for sure, this changes the nature of what it means to hire good salespeople for tier 4 data center colocation. The low end commoditized kind of services that feel more like you're selling a co-working space for servers. In many cases, those low-end purchases are all being driven to self-service purchases, self-service onboarding, because there's just not enough money in it for you to be able to afford competitive sales compensation. So what we're left with is selling more into the mid-market, selling more into the enterprise. And for your salesperson to be able to earn their way in and be seen more as a teacher, a consultant, a trusted advisor, and a subject matter expert, yeah, for sure, it's a significant leveling up on their technical knowledge, on their industry knowledge, to be able to add a lot of value to your prospects and clients going forward. So that's what it means to hire good salespeople going forward. We're going to take a quick break for a message from our sponsor. And when we come back, we will look at 3 really important areas, 3 additional sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.
Hey, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. We're all about elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. And you're watching our weekly Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value from this week's show so far, make sure that you hit the like button. If you have an idea for a topic that you think we should consider addressing in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments on whatever platform that you're watching from. So next question up is, how do we increase lead generation for data center power saving technologies? So your company's principally in the business of data center power saving, sustainability, power conservation. There's a number of synonyms for that, energy related savings. How do we increase lead generation for data center power savings technology? What it comes down to is really understanding the who and the why. Who are your best ideal clients that you want to do business with? When you define your ideal client profile, where they're located, their company size, their industries, their business models, what comes up at the account level? And in addition to the accounts that you want to be getting a foot in the door with for generating these leads, who are the people in those accounts that matter most? The most important person that shows up on the decision-making committee, we'll call that your primary buyer persona. The second most important person we'll call your secondary buyer persona. And we need to do our homework. We need to do the actual research, either face-to-face interviews or video interviews or surveys, or studying their search and social footprint for anywhere from 5, 10, 20 different people in that segment. And we need to find the consensus on their own words, What are the biggest goals that they're trying to achieve when it comes to power saving technologies in and around a data center, critical facility, or digital infrastructure? So what are the biggest goals? Sometimes this shows up in job descriptions and other related places in their own words. And the flip side of that, what are they struggling with the most when it comes to power saving technologies for data centers? So again, if we can get the consensus on those on a segment by segment basis for each of those personas, and we know which buyer personas to prioritize, that essentially becomes the starting point for building our lead generation playbook, for building our lead generation strategy, for developing, publishing, promoting, distributing educational resources, and planning, promoting, hosting amazingly impactful educational events around data center power saving. These could be offline events like hosting breakfast seminars, symposias, lunch and learns, either on your own or partnering with a company or association, organization, or something like that. Or these could be virtual events, or both. Like virtual events would be live streams, virtual conferences, webinars, things where people can attend from their own office or home office or wherever they are, anywhere in the country, actually anywhere around the globe. So the offline events would be most interesting if your prospects and clients in your addressable market, in your ideal client profile, tend to be located within relatively close proximity to where you're located, where they could be, say, within a 30 or 60-minute drive of being able to come down to your facility and enjoy a informative workshop, training session, whatever you want to call it, however you want to position it, at your own facility, in your training classroom, in your conference room, in your foyer that's been repurposed for that. And you recognize the massive impact that that can have in educating and building trust with individual stakeholders, and encouraging those individual stakeholders to bring their coworkers, their colleagues, their boss, who can also benefit from these educational experiences. For companies that are doing well with this, they sit down from what they learned from the buyer personas, and they are literally mapping out a monthly webinar. They're mapping out a monthly lunch and learn, a monthly breakfast seminar, or something like that for each of their most impactful buyer personas. And of course, not everyone that should attend will actually be able to attend. So by all means, record these, repurpose these, give the full version, chop them up in pieces, and give shorter versions, and do your vertical videos and your shorts and your carousels and your blog posts and your LinkedIn text posts and your email newsletters. This amazing content should fuel all of your lead generation plans, all of your lead nurturing plans for this particular buyer persona. So what it largely comes down to is, for increasing your lead generation for data center power saving technologies, is getting your company to really rally behind this as a super important initiative. And in most cases, it's going, depending on your company size, it'll go all the way to your most senior levels of leadership that say, hey, look, we have a problem. We're losing deals we shouldn't be losing. We're not retaining clients that we should be retaining, because in many cases, we're just not showing up. And we're tired of prospects and clients treating our team members like crap and taking us for granted. We're better than that. We have some super smart people on our team. Why is this the best kept secret? Well, going forward, we're not going to make it the best kept secret. We're going to invest significant resources in letting the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, know that in the right context, that for the segment, the data center power saving technology segment, that we are the leader, that we have the best expertise in this particular geographic region, for particular company sizes, for certain industries, and for certain kind of stakeholders. And for a lot of companies, this is such a big deal when it comes to really rethinking your go-to-market, when it comes to rethinking your sales and marketing playbook, that for a small to mid-sized company up to, say, a few hundred employees, your CEO really should be involved in promulgating and advancing that kind of message to get cultural buy-in throughout your company. Obviously, if you work for like a huge Fortune 1000 company with tens of thousands of employees, like your chief commercial officer, your chief revenue officer, your chief marketing officer may be the appropriate person to lead this charge. But for increasing lead generation for data center power saving technology, it largely comes down to not only understanding this customer insight better than your competition, but making a considered effort to play the long game and to show up early and often so that your client-facing team members have a strong presence as an educator, as in a trust-building kind of presence with the most important kind of members of those decision committees throughout their full buyer's journey. All of those 28 touch points, or as many of those 28 touch points as possible, from awareness to consideration, consideration to decision. So by the time they get to the point where they're ready to meet with a member of your sales team, they're heavily indoctrinated. They are heavily believe in your methodology for how to navigate the power saving technology segment within data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. So next question up, what do we got? How do we grow a data center decarbonization and heat reuse consultancy? So your company is primarily in the business of being a consulting firm that specializes in data center decarbonization and heat reuse. With what I know what's going on in the world right now, this is likely a stronger area of demand in Europe and in Asia than in the Americas. But I do strongly believe that at some point, as people start to get a lot more realistic on the severe limitations of energy usage and there starts to be some pushback, that there's going to be a very, very strong global movement for data center decarbonization and heat reuse to really be, if not the front burner issue with data center industry growth, but for sure among the top 3 to 5 most important areas going forward for data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. So to grow a consultancy where you want to be known as the be-all, end-all expert, either on the planet or in a particular geographic area for certain size companies and certain kind of industries, both with data center decarbonization and heat reuse, we need to figure out who are the right companies, which are the right companies, which are the right accounts that you want to have this presence, that you want to build this strong professional brand within, and who are the right stakeholders within these companies that matter most. When it comes to decarbonization and heat reuse, there's likely an ESG, environmental social governance kind of person that's involved in this. There's likely a compliance kind of person that's involved, assuming that there's regulatory issues that come up in your area. There's certainly financial implications. In a perfect world, the person leading the charge is probably a facilities executive, a data center facilities manager, facilities director. And it depends on your company size. It depends on their company size, how many different hats an individual wears, how many different roles that are either broken out into unique jobs or rolled up into fewer jobs because one person is taking on a lot of varied responsibilities because it's a smaller organization. But at the end of the day, we need to know who these stakeholders are. And when you've been successful in closing new consulting clients and retaining and expanding those clients, which stakeholder has had the biggest impact? That will call your primary buyer persona. The second most important stakeholder that shows up on the decision committee will rank them as your secondary buyer persona. And once we have figured out who are the companies where we want to be able to sell these decarbonization and heat reuse consultancy services and who are the individual stakeholders within these companies, then we need to do a little bit of research to understand for our primary and our secondary, our first and our second most stakeholder on these decision committees, what they care most about and what they care most about in their own words. Not what we think they care about, but what they actually care about in their own words. And getting their own words right is incredibly important, incredibly impactful for everything from your website copywriting, your product marketing materials, your collateral, your sales enablement templates, your events descriptions, your events copywriting, what you put on signage when you do offline events. All of this needs to take into account not only who the most important and second most important kind of stakeholders are, but what they care about most in their own words. And in a lot of cases, that research will help to fuel even some product roadmap decisions of what your services should look like going forward. You may discover some gaps on some areas that they care about intensely that you're not currently covering, that either you want to be covering in the near future or you want to partner with a complementary non-competing consultancy to loop in to provide an even more comprehensive menu of services around decarbonization and heat reuse. But if I was looking for a strong claim of topical expertise within that, not only would I put out the state of data center decarbonization and heat reuse every year, I'd probably name my newsletter something like that. I'd probably set up a podcast just like that. I'd set up a LinkedIn group about it. I'd work to try to build up a virtual conference or offline conference that has those nearly identical topics right in the title. I would perhaps writing a book, probably a digital book might be a safer bet if you're trying to advance a sustainability narrative, an ebook. But yeah, all of the above. If you're serious about letting the world know that you have the top consultancy that specializes in data center decarbonization and heat reuse, it's really important to dial in who the companies are that are going to care the most and who those stakeholders are that are going to care the most and what they actually care about, why they should listen to you in the first place. Because in a self-driven buyer's journey where they're just doing so much homework before you get to that initial meeting with people, we really, really need to make sure that we're showing up early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time, and most of all, in the right context, so that you're seen as the be-all end-all expert on anything and everything that comes comes full circle that's relevant to data center decarbonization and heat reuse. Fortunately, that's a small enough niche that it's unlikely you're going to face strong competitive pressure or commoditization anytime soon. Very, very different than a mature kind of business model like colocation. But at the same time, if they don't know you're out there, how are they going to put you into that consideration set? So I'm a huge fan of using interview-based content like interview-based podcasts, interview-based webinars to learn, create educational experiences that can help spread your message to other similar kinds of stakeholders. It's light social proof early on, and it also gives you a lot of very valuable research to help refine your offerings going forward. In the SaaS world, in the software technology space, going back as long as like 10 or 20 years, if you've ever heard of the book, The Lean Startup by Eric Ries or his mentor, Steve Blank, they call it getting out of the building. What that means is when we just talk about these things internally and we don't get input from stakeholders outside of our company, there's a lot of myopia that comes up. So in order to really, really figure out what's top of mind for specific kind of stakeholders and specific kinds of companies, when it comes to decarbonization, when it comes to heat reuse, it's incredibly important that we have face-to-face conversations, video calls, that we do surveys, that we study how they describe themselves, the kind of content they interact with, basically their search engine and social footprint that shows up when we look at what the breadcrumbs that certain kinds of people leave behind at the intersection of decarbonization and heat reuse. So that's how I would approach all this: prioritizing limited resources, prioritizing your buyer personas, having a specific revenue goal in mind, knowing what your average consulting engagement looks like. Like, for example, let's say you're starting this business in this consultancy in the European Union, and your goal, we'll keep the numbers really simple, was to have €1 million in turnover in year 1 or year 2 or something like that, or year 3, whatever it is. So you're looking to have a €1 million business, and the average consulting engagement is €100,000 annually. So you essentially need 10 consulting clients. You think your historical close rate is going to be that you're going to need 4 sales opportunities to get to 1 new client. So to get to 10 clients, you'd need 40 sales opportunities. And you think to get to 40 sales opportunities with a 10% lead to sales opportunity conversion rate, you'd need 400 early stage leads. So, these are just some quick back of the napkin numbers on reverse engineering your revenue goals into something around lead generation, lead nurturing, sales acceleration, deals. Obviously early on with a brand new business, you don't really know what you don't know. And until you get to product market fit and go to market fit, where you have a strong idea of exactly who these clients are, what they buy, at the price points, the durations, and everything just becomes an exercise in trying to accelerate that, which is all the more reason to get closer to your intended audience and get direct feedback from them on what specifically they're looking for help with when it comes to decarbonization and heat reuse. So that's how I would look to grow that kind of consultancy, how to grow a data center decarbonization and heat reuse consulting firm. If you've been getting good value from this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, make sure that you hit the like button. And if you have a topic, a question, or a challenge that you'd like us to consider addressing in an upcoming weekly show, make sure that you drop that in the comments as well, wherever you're watching. And that brings us to our final question that we're going to be addressing in this week's show, which is, how do we generate data center storage leads? How do we generate leads for data center storage? That's a fantastic question. And it's certainly a really big area right now in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. It's a really big area because AI, machine learning applications, big data, data analytics, high performance computing supercomputers take up massive amounts of disk space relative to legacy line of business applications that data center operators, data center colocation providers may have been used to as recently as 10 years ago. And because of that, there's enormous demands for storage. There's enormous demands for storage that doesn't use a ton of energy. There's an enormous amount of demand for storage that can last way longer than it ever has in the past. I spoke with a founder a couple weeks back, or maybe a month or two back, who was working on data center storage that was designed to last 100 years. So there's a lot of really, really interesting innovations happening in data center storage technology. But at the same point, we also need to recognize that storage is a mature category. And there's literally been hard drives in computers and servers going back decades. So from a innovation standpoint, from a product roadmap standpoint, you're likely always paying attention to what's coming next and needing to stay really close to your intended clients and your intended channel partners to make sure that you're delivering the same kind of storage solutions, the same kind of storage products and services that they need now and that they anticipate needing in the coming months. So with all of that in mind, lead generation for data center storage comes down to getting really specific about, at the company level, at the account level, where can you win most often? This is your ideal client profile. So in terms of where you can ship, where you can successfully market and sell, where you can successfully service your data center storage solutions, let's get the geography taken care of first. So that's global, or a group of countries, or a single country, or a region within a country. Get really specific in that ideal client profile of where you're going to be doing business, or where your channel partners potentially are doing business. Second, get realistic about what size companies are best suited for your kind of data center storage. Is your minimum level of purchase high enough that they have to have a certain size, a certain amount of resources, a certain amount of revenue to be able to realistically afford your entry-level products? Or is your entry-level point inexpensive enough that even a pre-revenue startup or a really small business could afford what you have? Along the same lines, is there an upper limit where a certain enterprise may have such demanding requirements on sales cycle length, compliance requirements, financial requirements, legal requirements, whatever it is, that you just may not be able to adequately address today, but are thinking about more down the road? So that's what would allow you to have a range for a minimum company size or a maximum company size that makes sense for dialing in your lead generation. And then are there certain industries, certain business models, certain verticals where you do better than others because of compliance issues, certification kind of issues, where you either have or don't have that ability? And again, that's going to vary depending on the region, because certain regions around the world, even in the United States, different states have different requirements around data centers and different amounts of regulation around data centers. And certainly healthcare, financial services, government, education, in many, many instances have specific needs around compliance and certification depending on the geographic area. So when it comes to the account level, when it comes to the company level, get specific about where these leads need to be located, how big or small the companies are there certain industries that should be targeted or excluded, depending on the nature of whether you have or don't have the ability to do business in that particular segment. So once we know that, next up, we need to figure out in these accounts, in these companies, who cares most about your storage technology. And a lot of it may depend on how big or how small your company is, or how big or how small their company is. In certain really, really tiny companies, an IT director or chief technology officer, if you're talking about like a co-location data center with 20 employees, it's entirely possible that every significant purchase decision having to do with data center storage has to cross the desk, has to go through the CTO. But just to put it in context, that CEO's entire team is 4 full-time people or 8 full-time people or something like that. So what that means is, in a really tiny company, even the most junior level person, even the intern, could be a good foot in the door for a lead generated. A lot of what screws up sales professionals and founders is many times they dismiss or disregard leads that are generated from very junior people on a particular team and in a junior organization. The reality, though, is in many cases, that junior person was sent to go research a particular category. And in this particular situation, like what's new in data center storage, and their need to report back to their boss, like a data center manager or network operations center manager or something like that, or infrastructure manager. So there's a lot to be said for building good rapport with that individual and letting them be your Sherpa, letting them be your guide to figure out like what was motivating this, what made them want to download this, what made them want to attend the webinar, what made them want to watch the recording of the webinar, whatever it is, and how are they addressing this need internally. And in many cases, you may be in the extreme small minority of people that takes these entry-level stakeholders seriously. And because of that, it's a really, really strong competitive advantage for figuring out like, who else is going to be on the decision committee and how do we get them to also enjoy these same kind of educational resources going forward. So at the account level, who's the ideal person that you want to be building this relationship? The most important economic stakeholder we'll call your primary buyer persona. The second most important kind of economic stakeholder on that decision committee when it comes to data center storage, we'll call your secondary buyer persona. And really large enterprise accounts, there may be a third or even fourth kind of person that shows up on a decision committee that needs its own unique content, that needs its own unique events experiences at the intersection of storage technology for their data centers, either because they're a data center operator or they're an end user, they're an enterprise with their own data centers. But either way, we need to be really dialed into the accounts where we can win and the stakeholders within those accounts that historically have been our strongest allies, both before, during, and post-purchase. And the before is a new thing to think about as well, because in a self-driven buyer's journey, which is now where most data center related technology purchase decisions are being made, the buyer is in the driver's seat. They are just doing tons of self-directed research before they ever get to you. This is very different than as recently as 10 years ago, where they typically got about halfway through researching storage. And at like the halfway point, at the 56% point at that time, they're like, okay, well, now I'm ready to talk to an account executive. Now I'll talk to a sales development rep. Those days are long gone. Baby boomers retiring, more Gen Z and millennials in decision-making roles, millions, tens of millions of people working from home, all of this digital transformation. Now, typically like 83% of a buyer's journey, nearly all of the buyer's journey is over before someone wants to meet with an account executive or a sales development rep. And this is a big challenge for a storage company with a very traditional playbook, but it's also a great opportunity if you're the one that shows up early and often, more as a consultant, a teacher, a trusted advisor, a subject matter expert, maybe even a thought leader on data center storage. And I think the biggest open area that a lot of people are overlooking is extreme sales specialization and lead generation specialization at the intersection of data center storage and specific industry segments. Because when you're the only one that has produced the definitive guide to data center storage for healthcare IT executives or financial services executives or manufacturing executives, you're really not going to have a lot of competition for that credibility. You're not going to have a lot of competition for, hey, there's 10 different webinars on this topic to go to in every given month. So yes, there's smaller segments, but because of that, you can be the 800-pound, you can really go into beast mode in that particular space with really crushing the know, like, and trust with your intended audience. So when it comes to generating data center storage leads, be aware of the self-driven buyer's journey. Get dialed into the companies that you want to grow your business within, the individuals within those companies. Figure out what those individuals, what those prioritized buyer personas really need to know in their own words, what they're struggling with the most, their biggest challenges, and what they're trying to achieve professionally, individuals, as a team, as a company, their biggest goals. Once you know their biggest goals and challenges, it's so much easier to get your website copywriting nailed down and relevant, to get your landing pages really dialed into what they care most about, to get your lead generation offers, to get the downloadables, to get the newsletter, the social posts, the videos, the webinars, the lunch and learns, all of that stuff. Once you know in their own words what they care most about, everything starts to work better. it's not just a matter of getting your lead volume up and your cost per lead down. It's setting the stage so that those particular stakeholders see your company as the be all end all expert when it comes to anything and everything having to do with data center storage. Like, you're completely crushing this category. You're like the HubSpot Academy of your space, of your segments, so much so that they want to spend time with members of your client facing team. You're not having to nag and bug them to get meetings to come in and do a pitch. They get so much value from spending time with your solutions engineers, your sales engineers, your account executives, your project managers, your account managers. They're learning so much from them that you're like cemented into the short list. And other companies that don't have that deep emotional bond with your prospects and clients, they're falling off the short list. And they're using your tools and resources as their methodology for how they're planning these initiatives, so much to the point that when they're finally ready for a sales conversation with you or a channel partner, they're literally quoting your experts. It's crazy, right? When this works, it is such a beautiful thing. But so many companies, even in this segment, are still thinking too transactionally. They're still like have this kind of hit and run mentality. They're still selling the same way they did 10 or 20 years ago. And it just doesn't work anymore. Even baby boomers, there's not a ton of baby boomers that are still actively working full-time in the data center ecosystem, but there's quite a few that work as advisors, that work on a part-time basis, on a fractional basis. And all the ones that I know, they're on LinkedIn all the time. They're constantly attending webinars. They're speaking at webinars. They're on other people's podcasts. They're very, very digitally savvy. So like, the world has changed. So if your lead generation playbook, if your lead nurturing, if your sales acceleration playbook hasn't kept up with these purchase preferences, this isn't something that's going to happen in a couple of years. This has already happened. And we know it's already happened because SaaS companies, software as a service companies, and infrastructure as a service companies have been running these kinds of educationally heavy playbooks for 8-10 years already, going back to like early mid 2010s. So the question is, are you going to show up in a way that gets you into these conversations where you're essentially getting invited into their side of the table? Or are you going to fight it kicking and screaming and say, no fair, I want to sell the same way I did back when MySpace was a thing and when there were still dial-up modems and there were still Blackberries, that would be hunky-dory awesome. Well, the world has changed. I see too many companies, especially data center operators and data center technology. It's like, would you like to buy some AI? And they're selling it out of like a horse and buggy. Like they want to print like postcards and mail them to people, or take out a bigger ad in a trade journal or something like that. It's insane. I don't know what causes them to make these kinds of conclusions, but if you do your customer insight research, if you figure out your buyer personas, and you get consensus on their biggest goals and challenges and where they hang out online and offline and what they care about and what influences the journey, it becomes a lot clearer where to make your significant investments in generating data center storage leads. So that's how I would approach creating a playbook, a go-to-market, a sales and marketing playbook for anything and everything having to do with entering new markets, growing your business, generating the right data center storage leads. So that's the final question that I'm going to be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you got great value from this week's show, make sure that you hit the like button. If you have a topic that you think we should address in an upcoming show, make sure to leave that in the comments. And if you want to make sure that you get notified about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our weekly Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can subscribe on our website at www.dcsmi.com. If we're not connected on LinkedIn, also feel free to mention that you watched this show, and I'll be happy to look forward to connecting with you as well. So glad that you're able to join us this week. Look forward to seeing you back next time, and I wish you great success in growing your influence, your team's influence, and your company's influence in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Take care now.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com. dcsmi.com.